Picture a land of incredible beauty, a long, slender country clinging to the eastern edge of the Asian continent, with emerald green rice paddies stretching as far as the eye can see and misty, forested mountains rising sharply in the distance. For centuries, the Vietnamese people lived by the rhythms of the monsoon rains and the cycle of planting and harvesting rice. Their villages were tight-knit communities, ancient temples dotted the landscape, and a deep sense of national identity was forged not in peace, but in the constant struggle to protect their homeland. They called their country the land of the ascending dragon. Before the war we know of, before the helicopters and the jungle battles that filled television screens around the world, Vietnam was a civilization that had stood firm against waves of foreign powers, most notably the immense empire of China to the north. They absorbed elements of these foreign cultures, like Confucianism and Buddhism, but always shaped them into something uniquely Vietnamese. However, by the mid-19th century, a new, far more technologically advanced power arrived from the other side of the globe, France. The French came not as guests but as conquerors, seeking wealth, resources, and imperial glory. They slowly and brutally took control, merging Vietnam with its neighbors, Laos and Cambodia, into a colonial possession they called French Indochina. This was not a gentle partnership. The French ran the country for their own benefit, building grand boulevards in cities like Hanoi and Saigon while taxing the Vietnamese peasantry into poverty. They controlled the lucrative salt, alcohol, and opium trades, and Vietnamese were treated as second-class citizens in their own land, their labor exploited on vast rubber and rice plantations. For decades, a quiet, simmering resentment burned in the hearts of the people, a deep desire to be masters of their own destiny once again. This longing for freedom set the stage for everything that was to follow, planting the very first seeds of a conflict that would eventually consume a generation and draw in the most powerful nation on earth. The story of the Vietnam War doesn't begin with a battle, it begins with this fundamental, human yearning for independence. Amidst this colonial darkness, a figure emerged who would become the very symbol of Vietnamese independence, a man who went by many names, but whom the world would come to know as Ho Chi Minh, meaning, he who enlightens. Born Nguyen Sinh Cung, he was a teacher, a sailor, a kitchen hand, and a man who traveled the world, witnessing firsthand the hypocrisy of the colonial powers. He saw how the French preached liberty, equality, and fraternity at home while denying those very rights to the people they ruled abroad. His political awakening took him to Paris, Moscow, and China, where he studied the powerful new ideology of communism. For Ho, communism wasn't just a complex economic theory, it was a practical, proven blueprint for overthrowing an empire, a method for organizing peasants into a revolutionary force that could fight a modern, well-armed oppressor. The perfect moment for his return came during World War II. When France itself fell to Nazi Germany, its Asian colony was left weak and vulnerable, and a new imperial power swiftly moved in to fill the vacuum, Japan. For the Vietnamese people, this meant trading one brutal foreign master for another. The Japanese occupation was a time of unimaginable hardship, culminating in a horrific, man-made famine in 1945 that killed nearly 2 million people. This tragedy radicalized the countryside and created a desperate, burning fury. Ho Chi Minh, now leading a movement called the Viet Minh, saw this chaos as an opportunity to finally seize freedom. They waged a clever guerrilla war against the Japanese from their bases in the northern mountains, all the while receiving secret aid from the United States, who saw them as useful allies against Tokyo. When the atomic bombs were dropped and Japan suddenly surrendered, a historic power vacuum opened up across Vietnam. The moment had arrived. In a powerful display of unity, the Viet Minh swept into the capital city of Hanoi. On a September day in 1945, before a sea of hopeful faces in Ba Dinh Square, a frail-looking man with a wispy beard stood up and declared Vietnam a free and independent nation. He even quoted the American Declaration of Independence, hoping the words of Thomas Jefferson would resonate with his former allies. It was a moment of pure hope, a dream of self-determination. But that dream was about to be betrayed, as the old colonial powers were already plotting their return. The joy of independence was tragically short-lived. Following the end of World War II, the victorious Allied leaders had already decided the fate of Indochina. France, desperate to reclaim its prestige and its empire after the humiliation of Nazi occupation, was determined to take back its colonial possession. At first, British forces arrived in the south to disarm the Japanese, and they immediately began rearming French soldiers who had been imprisoned during the war. The French wasted no time in ousting the Viet Minh administration in Saigon, sparking brutal street fighting. In the north, a tense negotiation took place, but the fragile peace shattered like glass. The French Navy bombarded the port city of Haiphong, killing thousands of civilians, and the first full-scale war for Vietnam, known as the First Indochina War, erupted. The French generals were confident of a swift victory. They possessed a modern, professional army with tanks, artillery, and an air force, while the Viet Minh were essentially a peasant army, lacking everything except a fierce determination. Ho Chi Minh's military genius, a man named General Vo Nguyen Giap, knew he could never defeat the French in a conventional, face-to-face battle. So, he chose a different path. He would trade space for time and bleed the enemy slowly. The Viet Minh melted into the jungle, moving supplies on foot and by bicycle along hidden trails, appearing from nowhere to launch devastating ambushes before vanishing back into the landscape. The war dragged on for years, becoming a frustrating, costly nightmare for France, a so-called dirty war that was deeply unpopular at home. By 1954, the French commanders, in a desperate bid to finally lure General Giap's forces into a decisive, annihilating battle, dropped thousands of their best paratroopers into a remote valley in the northwestern highlands. The place was called Dien Bien Phu. They aimed to cut Viet Minh supply lines and dare them to attack a fortified base. The French were convinced their artillery and air power would crush any assault. They made a fatal miscalculation. They never imagined that General Giap could haul heavy artillery pieces, piece by piece, up the sheer jungle-covered mountain slopes surrounding the valley. For months, his soldiers did just that, digging them into camouflaged bunkers that looked down upon the French garrison like gods on Mount Olympus. When the bombardment began, the French runway was destroyed, and their positions were shattered one by one. The valley became a mud-soaked hell of trench warfare. The siege lasted 56 agonizing days, and when it was over, the French force was utterly broken. An entire colonial army had been defeated by a peasant army, and the battle sent a seismic shockwave through the entire world, signaling that the age of European empires was truly coming to an end. The stunning defeat at Dien Bien Phu sent the French delegation reeling to the negotiating table in Geneva, Switzerland. The world's great powers gathered to decide the fate of a small, war-torn nation half a world away. What emerged from the 1954 Geneva Accords was a solution nobody truly wanted, and it was meant to be only temporary. A single line of latitude, the 17th parallel, was drawn straight across the map of Vietnam. This line was a demilitarized zone intended solely to separate the warring forces for a peaceful regrouping. The Viet Minh forces, the soon-to-be-named Communists, would retreat to the north, while the French and their Vietnamese allies would withdraw to the south. This was not, and this is a critical detail, a political division of the country. The Geneva Agreement explicitly called for nationwide, free elections to be held in just 2 years, in 1956, with the goal of unifying the country under a single, democratically elected government. It was a promise of a peaceful path to independence, an election that every observer knew Ho Chi Minh, a national hero, would win easily with perhaps 80% of the vote. But that election would never happen. In the South, a new leader rose to power with vigorous backing from the United States. His name was No Din Diem. An American official once described him as a man with a deep-seated patriotism and a narrowly paranoid personality. He was a Catholic in a deeply Buddhist country, a figure who had spent years abroad and lacked the common touch of a Ho Chi Minh. Crucially, Diem had no interest in honoring an election that he knew he would lose. With the quiet blessing and full financial support of the American government, he declared the southern half of Vietnam an independent state, the Republic of Vietnam, with himself as its president. The stage for a new conflict was now set because of a Cold War doctrine that gripped the minds of every American policymaker in Washington, D.C. It was called the domino theory. The idea was simple and terrifying. If one nation in Southeast Asia fell to communism, it would trigger a chain reaction, and the rest, countries like Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, would topple one after the other like a row of dominoes. In this worldview, Vietnam was not just a small, remote country, it was the cork in the bottle, the first and most crucial domino that absolutely had to be propped up. The United States replaced France as the Western power, propping up a non-communist state in the South, sending military advisors, equipment, and huge sums of money to build a nation from scratch. The irony was that in their determination to defend democracy, they were propping up a corrupt, authoritarian family regime that violently silenced any political opposition in the name of anti-communism. The promise of a peaceful election was buried, and the country was divided, setting brother against brother. In the years following Diem's rise to power, South Vietnam did not become a stable, free nation. Instead, it descended into a police state. President Diem's regime, run largely by his powerful and ruthless brother Nhu, launched a brutal campaign to root out any political opposition. They didn't just target communists, they targeted anyone who could be labeled one. Buddhist monks and intellectuals who simply wanted a voice were rounded up, imprisoned, and often executed without trial. Land was taken from the peasants and handed back to the wealthy landlords who had collaborated with the French. The immense American financial aid, meant to build a nation, was stolen and funneled into the pockets of corrupt officials. A deep, boiling anger began to simmer in the countryside and the cities. Back in the north, in Hanoi, the leadership watched the betrayal of the 1956 election with a bitter, patient fury. Initially, they advised their comrades who remained in the South to engage in political struggle, to protest and agitate peacefully. But as Diem's crackdown became a mass murder of their members, killing tens of thousands, the policy changed. In 1960, the National Liberation Front was officially formed, a broad coalition of communists, Buddhist activists, and non-communist nationalists, all united by a single burning goal: the overthrow of the Diem regime. The Diem government contemptuously called them the Viet Cong, a derogatory slang term meaning Vietnamese communist, a name that would become infamous. The Viet Cong were not a foreign army, they were the very definition of a grassroots insurgency. During the day, a fighter could be a farmer, a quiet plower of the fields, or a village schoolteacher. At night, that same person was a dedicated revolutionary, digging deadly booby traps, gathering intelligence on government troop movements, or serving as a courier. The situation became a pressure cooker, and the lid finally blew off in the spring of 1963 in the ancient imperial city of Hue. The deeply unpopular Diem, a Catholic, had banned the flying of the Buddhist flag during a religious festival. When thousands of Buddhists gathered for a peaceful protest against the discriminatory decree, government troops opened fire into the unarmed crowd, killing 9 people in cold blood. The horrifying event sparked a wave of fury across the nation. Then came an act of ultimate, shocking defiance that seized the world's attention. An elderly Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc sat down calmly in the middle of a busy Saigon intersection. His fellow monks doused him with gasoline. Without uttering a single word of protest, he struck a match and set himself on fire. The iconic photograph of this serene man engulfed in flames, sitting perfectly still, was printed on the front page of every major newspaper in the world. The image became a horrifying symbol of a government that had lost all legitimacy and a desperate people crying out for change. The horrifying image of the burning monk shocked the world and convinced the Kennedy administration in Washington that President Diem had become a dangerous liability. In a swift coup d'état just weeks later, Diem was overthrown and assassinated by his own generals, with the quiet green light from the American Central Intelligence Agency. The hope was that new military leadership would bring stability. The reality was a catastrophic descent into chaos. For the next few years, Saigon became a revolving door of military juntas, one general replacing another in a series of coups that left the government weak, corrupt, and utterly disconnected from the people. This political disintegration was exactly what the Viet Cong had been waiting for. With the regime in disarray, the communist insurgency made massive territorial gains, moving from small-scale ambushes to large-scale conventional attacks, overrunning entire districts and villages. By 1964, South Vietnam was on the verge of total collapse, a house of cards trembling in a high wind. For the new American president, Lyndon B. Johnson, who had inherited this mess after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, this was a terrifying, unacceptable outcome. He could not be the president who lost Vietnam. The event that handed him the blank check for direct, massive American intervention came not on land, but at sea, in the murky, troubled waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. The official story presented to Congress and the American people was one of unprovoked aggression. On a dark, stormy night in August 1964, a United States Navy destroyer, the USS Maddox, was on an intelligence-gathering mission in international waters when it was, according to the reports, suddenly attacked without warning by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. 2 days later, in a highly charged and confused atmosphere, a second, even more dubious attack was reported by jittery sailors tracking phantom radar blips on a night of bad weather. President Johnson seized the moment. In an urgent, solemn televised address to the nation, he described the incidents as outright acts of war against the American flag. In response, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution with near unanimous approval, giving the president the power to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack and to prevent further aggression. This resolution was not a declaration of war, but it might as well have been. It was a blank check, and President Johnson would soon cash it in a massive, earth-shattering way. Years later, it would be revealed that the Maddox had been actively supporting South Vietnamese commando raids against the North Vietnamese coast, and that the second attack on August 4 simply never happened. It was a false alarm based on nervousness and bad acoustics. But by the time the truth came out, it was far too late. The gears of a full-scale American war machine had already begun to turn, and there was no stopping them. The young American men who stepped off the planes and onto the tarmac of a steamy airbase in South Vietnam in 1965 entered a universe utterly alien to anything they had trained for. They were not the battle-hardened soldiers of D-Day landing on a clearly defined beach. They were teenagers, many of them fresh out of high school, drafted into a war they didn't fully understand in a country whose language, culture, and geography were a complete mystery. The United States military, the most technologically advanced fighting force in human history, was built for a conventional war in the open plains of Europe against the Soviet Union. Now, it was being thrust into a conflict where the front line was everywhere and nowhere. The enemy did not wear a uniform, did not hold a static trench line, and could melt into a village of frightened peasants in the blink of an eye. This was a guerrilla war, and the jungle was the enemy's greatest ally. The environment itself seemed to be fighting them. There were double and triple canopy rainforests that blocked out the sun so completely that a soldier on the ground walked in a permanent, green twilight. There was the elephant grass, razor-sharp blades that grew taller than a man's head, cutting any exposed skin. The monsoon rains came down not as drops but as solid walls of water, turning the red clay earth into a clinging, boot-sucking mud that rotted the men's feet and jammed their weapons. And then there was the enemy's unseen world. Beneath the jungle floor, the Viet Cong had created a sprawling, claustrophobic network of underground tunnels. These were not just simple crawl spaces, they were entire subterranean cities containing hospital rooms, weapons caches, kitchens with cleverly vented smoke systems, and booby-trapped sleeping quarters. In a war that was deeply psychological, the soldiers faced a terrifying new tactic, the booby trap. A tripwire on a jungle path could unleash a barrage of poisoned bamboo punji stakes, spring-loaded like a medieval device, piercing through a boot and shattering the bones of a foot. A soldier reaching for a dangling piece of equipment could trigger a rigged artillery shell. The constant, nerve-shredding terror of the booby trap meant that every single step, every fallen leaf, every beautiful, brightly colored flower could be a hidden instrument of mutilation or death. To try and defeat an enemy they could not see, the U.S. military turned to its overwhelming technological advantage, air power. But the weapon they chose was a terrifying chemical agent called Agent Orange. This toxic defoliant was sprayed in millions of gallons from the sky, stripping entire jungles bare and destroying the enemy's concealment and food supply. The war was not a straightforward fight for territory, it was a grim, bloody war of attrition, where success was absurdly measured by body counts, a metric that would create a catastrophic and monstrous disconnect between the reality of the war and the optimistic reports delivered to the American public by generals in Saigon. By the start of 1968, the American military command in Saigon, led by General William Westmoreland, was feeding the public a steady diet of optimism. The message was always the same: we are making great progress, we are winning the body count war, and there is a light beginning to flicker at the end of the long, dark tunnel. The American people were told the enemy was on the ropes, dwindling and unable to mount any major offensive. What happened next would shatter that illusion with such force that it permanently broke the American will to win. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong leadership had crafted a master plan of breathtaking audacity. They called it the Tet Offensive, named after the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, a sacred time of family and ceasefire. In a brilliant piece of strategic deception, they feinted attacks near the Khe Sanh base, drawing American attention into the remote mountains. Then, on the night of January 30th, as millions celebrated the holiday, the silent preparations ended. In a perfectly coordinated wave, approximately 80,000 communist soldiers launched a simultaneous surprise attack on over 100 cities, towns, and military installations across the entire length of South Vietnam. It was not a guerrilla action, it was a full-scale, nationwide assault. The audacity was staggering. Viet Cong suicide squads breached the walls of a United States embassy in Saigon itself, the very nerve center of American power, and held the compound for 6 desperate, bloody hours. The fighting on the embassy grounds was broadcast live, and Americans watching the evening news could see the chaos unfolding in what was supposed to be the most secure location in the country. But the most savage and pivotal battle took place in the north, in the beautiful, ancient city of Hue. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars captured the historic citadel and city center, and for 25 horrifying days, the city was a scene of total, house-to-house, room-to-room urban warfare. United States Marines fought a medieval battle for block after block, a brutal struggle made even more iconic by the grim, black and white footage of them fighting beneath a tattered American flag. In pure military terms, the Tet Offensive was a staggering defeat for the Communists. The Viet Cong, who led the charge, were essentially wiped out as an effective fighting force, suffering unimaginable losses. But in political and psychological terms, Tet was a monumental strategic victory for them. The bloody, visceral images of the fighting, broadcast unfiltered into American living rooms, screamed one undeniable truth: the generals had been lying. The enemy was not almost defeated. The light at the end of the tunnel was not a ray of hope, it was an oncoming train. The credibility gap between what the government said and what the people could see with their own eyes became an unbridgeable chasm, and public opinion turned against the war with a sudden, terrible finality. The chaos and violence of the Vietnam War could not be contained within the borders of a single country. It was a contagion that spread to consume the entire region. As the war raged in Vietnam, a secret and devastating parallel war was being fought in the neighboring kingdom of Laos. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the crucial North Vietnamese supply artery, snaked its way through the dense Laotian jungle, and the United States was determined to sever it. For nearly a decade, the Central Intelligence Agency ran a clandestine army of Hmong tribesmen, led by a remarkable general named Vang Pao, to fight a shadow war against the North Vietnamese. Above this hidden ground war, American pilots flew relentless bombing missions, transforming Laos into the most heavily bombed country per capita in the history of warfare. Planes that had not dropped their full payload on Vietnam would offload their remaining bombs on Laotian soil on the return journey, blanketing the land in a rain of fire that, tragically, continues to kill and maim farmers today with unexploded cluster munitions. The conflict then spilled directly into Cambodia, a neutral nation caught tragically in the middle. Under a new president, Richard Nixon, who had promised a secret plan to end the war, the United States instead widened it drastically. In a campaign hidden from Congress and the American public for years, Nixon ordered massive B-52 bomber strikes on suspected communist sanctuaries inside Cambodia. This secret bombing, exposed by courageous whistleblowers, shattered the country's fragile neutrality and drove the desperate, terrified Cambodian peasantry into the waiting arms of a previously insignificant extremist group, the Khmer Rouge. This was a monster the American bombing inadvertently helped create, and its rise to power would lead directly to one of the most horrific genocides of the 20th century, the infamous Killing Fields. Back home, the moral reckoning had arrived in a burst of gunfire. On a spring day at Kent State University in Ohio, young students protesting the invasion of Cambodia were confronted by National Guardsmen. In a chaotic, panicked moment that still defies understanding, the guardsmen opened fire on the unarmed crowd, killing 4 students. The photograph of a young woman screaming in anguish over the body of a fallen student became the defining image of a nation tearing itself apart. The war was no longer a distant geopolitical chess game, it was a bloody, screaming civil conflict being fought on college campuses and in the streets of America, a wound that cut to the very soul of the nation. After years of devastating conflict, the blood-soaked stalemate finally stumbled toward its agonizing end. The policy was called Vietnamization, a strategy of slowly withdrawing all American ground combat forces while heavily arming and training the South Vietnamese army to fight the war on its own. On paper, the South Vietnamese forces were formidable. They were given the latest American weapons, helicopters, and jet fighters, and their numbers were vastly superior to their enemies. But an army is not built with mere equipment, it is built on morale, leadership, and a reason to fight. The South Vietnamese military was hollowed out by chronic corruption, with officers stealing payment for their soldiers and selling fuel and ammunition on the black market. In January 1973, a peace agreement, the Paris Peace Accords, was signed in a grand hotel in France. America's longest war to that point was officially over, and the last combat troops departed, leaving behind a fragile, lonely nation to face its fate. The peace was a fiction. It was merely a temporary pause before the final, terrible act. In the spring of 1975, the North Vietnamese High Command launched a final, massive conventional invasion. Their Soviet-supplied tanks did not encounter any fierce American air power to halt their advance. Instead, they found a South Vietnamese army that crumbled into chaos upon contact. Panic spread faster than the tanks could move. In a desperate, chaotic rout, entire divisions abandoned their uniforms and weapons, simply melting away and fleeing for their lives toward the one last hope of escape, Saigon. The final chapter was a scene of pure human desperation, an apocalyptic nightmare unfolding on the roof of the world. Operation Frequent Wind was the code name for the largest helicopter evacuation in history. American and South Vietnamese helicopters flew non-stop from aircraft carriers offshore into the besieged city, landing on the rooftop of the American embassy and various CIA safe houses. Lines of terrified, weeping Vietnamese men, women, and children, who had worked for the Americans and knew the horrors that awaited them, clawed and fought to get through the gates. In a sequence of images that are now seared into the global memory, overloaded helicopters lifted precariously from the rooftop, and desperate people clambered up the sides of the embassy walls. The final image of the war was of a lone, lanky Huey helicopter sitting on a pad as people on a nearby stairwell tried desperately to get a seat, as if begging for a ride that would never come. North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace, the Viet Cong flag was raised, and Saigon fell. The war was over, but its long, silent shadow would stretch across both Vietnam and America for generations, a terrible testament to the human cost of a conflict that left wounds far too deep to ever fully heal.